So this session, what we're really going to go back to is looking at this question of coalitions, partnerships, and collective action. And we're going to look at how and why coalitions and collective action make a difference, and what are the implications for our thinking about how change happens and for NGOs. So that's the focus of the session. And if we go back to this, what we're really kind of going to explore a little bit in some detail is these questions of how relationships, alliance, coalitions, collective action work. Now clearly that is related to interests of power and politics and culture, but this is the particular focus we're going to look at in this final session today. And I think part of this is about recognizing that change doesn't happen on its own, notwithstanding what Nate said this morning about the importance of individual motivation and the rest of it. But the recognition that the kinds of problems that we're talking about and the kind of issues we're dealing with mean that change cannot happen on its own. And it needs forms of alliance, partnerships, and relationships. Adrian Lefwich, who was the kind of guru behind the Developmental Leadership Program, a research program that's been looking at collective action for the last 5 or 10 years, said it like this, that the interaction, often competitive but also sometimes cooperative, amongst more or less formally organised groups on the one hand, and between them and the structures of politics and economics, shapes the direction and dynamics and development of change, or frustrates it. And that's politics, and its outcomes are decisive for development. So he doesn't make a judgment about whether it's formal or informal, whether it's good or bad, whether it's competitive or cooperative. It's just that it is. And I think that what his main conclusion is that a lot of development thinking either ignores politics and says we can do this without politics, or thinks politics is bad and therefore somehow we need a technocratic way of getting around it, rather than accepting it as something that is part of the process of change and you have to take it into account. But the second thing he suggests is that the heart of politics of everyday life, and especially the politics of development, are coalitions. And these might be formal or informal. They might be groups of individuals within organisations, groups of organisations. They might be government, non-government. They may be across those sectors. But they're groups that come together to achieve particular things that they would not be able to achieve on their own. So the 2 points he makes is that it's about politics, stupid, and that coalitions and alliances and relationships are key to understanding politics. So how and why collective action makes a difference? So there's some pretty obvious things, is that many of the problems we face are collective action problems. So the issues of climate change, the issues of indigenous rights, these aren't issues of individuals. They're issues of collectively individuals acting, creating common problems that affect many people, or us all in the case of climate change. And that the obvious answer to a collective action problem is a coalition or collective action to try and address it. The second and obvious issue is that trade unions would tell you for a long time, or the women's movement, is that the strength together, and I love the fish analogy, is that little fish, piranhas, can bring down bigger fish, etc. The point that's often also made is that what a coalition can do is it can bring together the different skills, experience, and knowledge necessary to address a problem. So if you've got a women's movement that needs to address the attitudes of police, violence against women legislation, ability to work with the churches, you're going to need different skills and experience in that coalition in order to be able to address those different issues. Venue shopping. Now, stop me if I tell the story last time, because it's a story I'm fond of, but the Brent Spar Oil Rig, did I bring that up last time? No, okay, good, thank you for that. So, do people know about the Brent Spar Oil Rig? So in the North Sea, it was probably late 90s, was an oil rig that had come to the end of its natural life. And BP were going to sink it.
Oh, yeah.
They towed it.
They towed it. What happened?
Environmental groups took action and changed the course of history.
Yeah. So you remembered it nearly completely. So the critical part of it was that it was at first British environmental groups tried to take this on in Britain, and they moved it from a technical venue to a political venue. So instead of trying to argue the case within the technically, because actually it was a bit dubious whether it was better to sink it versus not, they took it into the political arena.
To Netherlands?
Yes, and then they took it to the Netherlands because they were losing the debate in the UK. But once they moved the debate to the Netherlands, boycotts on BP service stations ramped up, and that's what then drove action. Now, the importance of that from the point of view of a coalition is that if you've got trust and coalition members and actors in different venues, political venues, you might move the argument to where you are more likely to win it. As we saw this morning in some senses, collective action is often driven by threats or bad news. So the threat of racism, the threat of discrimination, the feeling of being under threat, it drives people to take risks that they otherwise wouldn't have, and enables them potentially to seize critical junctures. And by critical junctures, what we often see, for example, the role of women during conflict often shifts dramatically because, in the case of Britain in the Second World War, people needed munitions built, and women went into roles that they otherwise weren't playing. There's always a question about whether those roles continue after the war, and they are put back in the kitchen. In Eritrea and in particular, in the TPLF, there was a whole debate about whether those roles had changed over time. And so that's how a critical juncture shakes up and provides opportunities for coalitions and groups to then explore. And I think the final point about how collective action can make a difference is this question of framing. And in your papers, you may have read the Busby paper on how Bono made Jesse Helms cry. I'm sure you got to that. Maybe it's on day 4's reading list, actually. But the argument is that the debt relief campaign changed the framing of the debate on debt relief. So the debate on debt relief, particularly in the 90s, was framed by, you've got to forgive countries' debt. And the argument tended to be from those economists and politicians opposing this, that this would create moral hazard, which is the economics way of saying that if we forgive those people debt, then everybody will not pay their debts, and then what will happen then? What the debt campaigners successfully did in the late 90s is reframe that debt from an economic argument to a moral one. And they started particularly with the debate in Uganda saying, if you do not forgive this debt, X million kids aren't going to get an education or aren't going to get a health service. So that was a reframing from an economic framing to a moral framing, which, with the churches and Jubilee then taking it the critical juncture of having the opportunity of a millennium, which only comes around every 1,000 years or so, allowed for that reframing to then gain traction. So this is some of the ways that coalitions and collective action can make a difference. Now, some of the key findings, and I will stop after this. So, I mean, the findings that are suggested by some of these cases is that coalitions actually don't always have to be inclusive to be successful. That Doris Day's certainly wasn't, the Green Growth Coalition certainly isn't, but they have effected change. The question would be, is that change going to be sustained if you don't have a strong women's movement in Vanuatu that is actually going to push forward things? if you don't have a stronger grass movement on climate change. So there's a question there, but they don't have to be inclusive, but that raises questions. Leaders can be found in both the formal and informal sphere and have hard or soft power. So in Simbo, although that leader of that coalition is a very strong leader, she is in a very informal space. She's not in a informal space. And there is an argument that that is where a lot of women political leaders and coalition leaders choose to be in the Pacific. You don't have to like your leaders. I mean, you work in organisations, you know this. Doris Day Kenneth and some of the others, they've got very sharp elbows, and they don't necessarily behave in a way, but why should they? And the really interesting question is that often women who behave like that are considered less good leaders than men who behave in exactly the same way. So that's a question. And coalitions are not fixed or formal, but fluid, evolving, and particularly in the Pacific this seems to be the case. And the more that organisations support these coalitions and ask them to put into place committees, governance structures, finance systems, and the rest of it, the more they turn them into bad organisations rather than good coalitions. Coalition members are not all equal, and some people might not even know they're part of a coalition. Certainly, Doris Day used the notion of coalition and the rest of it for political purposes. What does that say? That if you look at all of these programs, between $200,000 over 5 years in one case, up to $700,000 over 5 years, this is not a lot of money. A lot of money for meetings and pigs and that sort of thing, but not travel. But a lot of staff time, and a lot of things that would be considered overheads. They didn't spend much on capital. In fact, nothing. This was a lot of staff time, a lot of travel time, a lot of cost. How do you justify that if you've got to justify a budget in terms of value for money in the current context, and you've got very flexible spending? You can think and work politically to make progress on issues not high on the political agenda. It's not just about accepting elite priorities. There's a lot of stuff at the moment about going with the grain. That because of cultural and political processes locally, we need to go with the grain, otherwise we're not going to achieve things. Some of these examples have gone with the grain in the sense, and Tonga is a very good one, the sense of making sure that princes and nobilities were brought into the process. But they've actually shifted something very dramatically in Tonga in terms of accountability. So there's, I think, a tension, and there's always been a tension, particularly around gender issues, and going with the cultural grain and what that then means in terms of trade-offs with change. Does it mean that good governance ideas of inclusion, participation, accountability, transparency are unrealistic? Do we need to be more pragmatic? Question mark. For generally locally led development, is the question of partnership, is it because we have a notion of partnership which is largely one-on-one partnership? So we have a contract, and it's often a partnership that is contractual. And although there's a very interesting ODI paper that was out yesterday on what does all this mean for contracting? It's worth taking a look at, because I think if you get down to the business processes, there's some really big obstacles, and the contracting one is absolutely. What does a contract look like for this? Is contract the right word? Can you, if it's formed in this way, is it forever going to be different? And what does multi-partnership, stakeholder partnership look like if contracting isn't our frame of reference? So I think there's a question there. It's not only about the money, it's about how the money can be spent. So pigs and food and the rest of it, actually, if that's what makes it work, why not? And the question of longer term funding. I mean, there's a very interesting article that Lance Pritchett wrote about the J curve. So that if you've got a program that isn't performing under certain metrics, but you've got continued episodes of advocacy, and you're building a network, and when that political critical juncture arrives, you suddenly get and trigger change. So if you're into short-term results and measurable results, you're not going to see that potential. So there are a number of big questions that then raises. Staff who think and work politically, the Pacific Leadership Programme staff are activist staff who happen to choose to work in PLP because they think it's going to make a difference. How well do we cope with the idea of activist staff who have their own political agenda and understand it? And what they can do in terms of brokering relationships in particular, and how do you provide an enabling environment for them to actually use your organisation to behave politically? Difficult questions. What was important for PLP was regular reflection and refocus sessions, which they brought in people like Jaime Faustino and others in the early days to actually challenge them and the rest of it. They had what they repeated, and Deborah's quoted this interestingly in her. She's done some work on this. Some hard talk sessions, which were mirrored on the BBC thing, asking hard questions of each other about whether they're making a difference or not. As Deborah has pointed out, culturally, this was very interesting for in terms of how culturally in the Fiji and the Pacific conflict is dealt with. Interesting questions. Imaginative ways to monitor and communicate program. This was a real problem for PLP, and it remains a problem today. Why we invested in the action research process is because we felt we needed long-term, ongoing observation of what was changing, as opposed to snapshot monitoring and evaluation. We tried a whole host of stuff, outcome harvesting, a whole host of stuff that really didn't work. So there's really a challenge there, and I think part of the solution has got to be, how do you, if we talk about this propensity of networks and coalitions to change, how do we understand and measure the propensity of something to do something in the future? Now, there's a lot of professions that do that. Propensity to commit crime is something that is explored. Propensity to take drugs is explored. So maybe there are different things we need to explore. And the whole question of risk, and the appetite for risk, and the fact that not all bets will pay off. So PLP supported exactly the same process they supported in Tonga, they supported in Vanuatu, and nothing happened. But that was a relatively safe fail for them. They had a meeting, not much happened. In Tonga, they had a meeting and something took off. So how do we create safe fail experiments that can test an idea but don't actually risk a lot? And so in the end, we got some big obstacles to overcome. Branding. When I worked at Oxfam, they closed the gap issue. If that had been branded in Oxfam came, it would have been dead in the water on day 2. Yet, and I was part of these discussions at a management team level, why aren't we branding this? God, this would be great publicity for us. That would be good, really good for us. So branding is an issue, and that discussion within agencies is an issue. Bureaucratic demands, risk management can make the spread betting approach difficult if we're really spreading our bets and failing. So this question of what does a safe fail look like, and how can one accommodate that? And it's interesting, I've heard the notion that actually talking to managers and senior leaders about reverse psychology is quite good. So telling people that your organisation is probably not ready to do innovative work, it's not ready to take risks, it's not ready to actually do what the literature suggests. Funnily enough, there are a number of people who go, oh, bloody hell, of course we are. Particularly macho managers really like that. So maybe reverse psychology is the way to go. This question of long timelines, J-curves, and high overhead seen as a problem. PLP, a lot of staff, heavy, a lot of travel, not much else. But if one can capture these stories better, arguably it's a much more cost-effective way of working. So I think there's a value that we just need to be explaining in much better ways. Diversity of interests and difference in values needs to be accommodated, but how does one do that without undermining a value set of an organisation in value-driven organisations? I think the notion of what is called policy bundling, which in India and China you've seen on climate change, where different interests have been cleverly bundled to achieve, as John was talking about, to achieve the same purpose, but from different interests, seems to be important. The measurement challenges are big. An attribution to individual agencies is hard, and uniform indicators of process is not helpful. Particularly in PLP's case, if you are wanting to support coalitions that are going to look different in different places, standardisation is the last thing you want to do. And last week I was at the Australian Implementation Conference. It was a rather painful experience, I have to say, for me. These are implementation scientists, right? And basically they are saying you need greater fidelity in intervention in order to measure this stuff properly. So i.e., stop making things different in different places, you need to make them the same, and everybody needs to, then you'll be able to measure the outcomes. And there's a whole thing coming down the track on implementation science that I think is actually quite dangerous. And the head of the World Bank's very keen on it. So there's something to watch.
And they went to talk to DFO.
And they went to talk to DFO, I think. So that's something to watch. The only answer I could give is that in Britain, when Tony Blair and his government went down this route, it was laughed off as deliverology, and somebody said deliverology is Mickey Mouse command and control, and that's unfair to the mouse. But the final question, and this tries to wrap up the day in one dot point, narratives of aid can preclude international coalitions and the need to address common problems. Because if we're arguing that a lot of this is about common problems and coalitions at a different level, how we tell the story about what development is, how change happens, we play into narratives and stories that perpetuate a way of thinking about our role that is not very helpful. And the danger also is if we don't factor in the complexity concerns, we then try and hold governments to account for SDGs as if they were global log frames. So we say, where is your plan for the achievement of SDGs? What are your key performance indicators? Where is your measurement? So the things that we know in our practice are detrimental, we then advocate for in other forums. So the consistency of that is really problematic. So how the narratives here become really important. And so that takes us back to this morning. And the question of stories and narratives and alternative forms of knowledge and understanding that perhaps need to be part of the mix. So there's some few obstacles that we will overcome in the course of your case studies. And next time